Our next speaker is joining us remotely. He is a visiting scientist at MIT Media Lab and senior visiting researcher at Ritsumeikan University. He is recognized as a leading thinker at the intersection of management, data, workplace, and people. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ben Waber.
All right, hi everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there, but thank you. Hope everyone can hear me okay? Good? Okay. I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me unless someone tells me differently. But again, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there, but it's so nice to be able to again present to everyone. まあそれで今回英語で発表しますけれども、もし不明点があれば日本語でも聞いてもいいと思います。Yeah, so just that's also fine if we want to do that in the Q&A session. Happy to switch to whatever language is most appropriate. So I think it's really nice to follow Takahashi Sensei, especially as she was talking about really the different perspectives people have on what systems we should develop and how we should use those systems. And I think this is really important because my background is actually originally in computer science, and a lot of the ways that we're trained is to optimize systems on a particular outcome metric, right? And we're going to optimize the hell out of it, and we'll get really good at that. One of the problems is, I think we've really become myopic around the kinds of systems that we can create. And we've also flattened the type of sort of diversity in the ways that we could use different, technical systems, right? And one of the problems is that the way that we try to measure the quality of a system. I mean, again, Takahashi Sensei was talking about, for example, systems that assist elderly people, right? Well, there's not one objective way to measure that. Right? What we define as performance, what we define as productivity, it's inherently a subjective metric. Now, again, you could add quantitative metrics to it. It could be somewhat qualitative as well, but there's nothing objective about it, right? These are choices, right? But you're bringing a cultural context to that. You're bringing your personal biases. You're also bringing just the technological affordances that what can you actually measure, right? If all I can measure is how many boxes someone packs, right, and I can't measure anything else about how they work in an office or in a warehouse environment, then that's what I'm going to define as productivity. But that doesn't mean that that is an objective metric, right? It's quantitative, right? But we need to be careful about what we say we're optimizing for. And this is particularly important when we're talking about now AI systems that are entrusted with more and more decisions, and where more and more people are claiming that these systems are, doing things in a compassionate way, for example. And again, just we need to continually remind ourselves that there's not one definition of that. There's many ways to define that, and depending on what our values are, depending on where we're deploying it, we have to think, I think, very, very differently than how we've developed technological systems up to now, right? And actually, one example. So I'm here in Boston right now. A really interesting example here is where I live on the land of originally the Massachusetts people, and they had a farming method called the Three Sisters method. And I don't know if we have any agricultural folks in the audience, but the Three Sisters method, essentially what it was the native people, and actually a lot of North America, would essentially plant fields by combining three crops, corn, beans, and a squash, right, on the same land. Okay. And the reason that that's interesting is if you do that, you don't have to leave land fallow. So you don't have to. So if, for example, if I just plant a field of just wheat, again, this is before modern fertilizers, then every 7 years you would have to not plant anything there so the nitrogen could recover in the soil. And it turns out actually with a Three Sisters method, you don't have to do that. Now, what's interesting is that when the European colonists came over to North America, they practiced monoculture, right? So you planted a single field of just one crop. And what they were trying to do is maximize the output of that particular crop per acre, right? And they did. They could actually output more, even when they started doing this with corn, they could output more corn per acre than you could on the Three Sisters method. So one could claim that that is a more productive method, right? But again, there's not an objective metric. That is a choice. If instead I actually measured the calories per acre If I actually measured even the total economic value of all the crops grown per acre, actually the Three Sisters method was superior until well into the late 1800s. So it's pretty impressive. But again, this idea that our framing, right, determines what we actually optimize for, right? And again, in agricultural systems, these things, change a lot more slowly than they do when we're rolling out a new AI system, which is why it's so much more important. And I'm just going to use a single example to for us to try to unpack what this means in the real world, right? The fact that we have many different ethical systems, not just globally and between different countries, but even within single countries, right? I'm sure, down in Kansai, people, are thinking, have different things they'd like to optimize for that, than people up in Kanto and all these things like that. But let's use hiring as an example. And part of my background is around work, so I'm very comfortable talking about this example, right? So there's, I think, a first question that I think Takahashi Sensei did bring up, but I would argue that in most settings we don't even discuss, which is should we use algorithms in this case, right? Like, is it ethical to use hiring algorithms, right? Typically, we skip that and we just say, how can we make a more fair hiring algorithm, right? But that just a lot that ignores this first basic question, which is, is that appropriate? And again, importantly, different people, even within the same culture, will have different responses, and there's not a right answer. Now, again, you have to have a framework for actually making these decisions, and I think lots of organizations, you might, I had a piece in Harvard Business Review, actually last year, with a number of different folks, and we actually examined a few organizations, and if you look at how HP Enterprise does this, I really like that. Just as an aside, they don't pay me, so that's not an advertisement, but they do good work. Um, and then there's this next question, right, about what does it even mean to use algorithms or to use AI, right? Because we always say that. We say, like, oh, I'm going to use AI to solve a problem. But, like, okay, most of us know at this point the term AI is just a marketing term. Like, it doesn't really mean anything. It's a whole collection of different, tools, right? And that's fine. But then, if we just say, I'm going to use AI to solve this problem, we're not actually saying what we're doing. We need to be very specific. And then again, we have to apply an ethical lens to that, right? So if I say I want to use a standard, I don't know, linear regression method to predict how someone's going to perform in a job, that's very different than saying I'm going to use a deep learning mechanism to just I'm going to throw in examples of previous folks and then hope it spits out something. Again, I'm not saying one is necessarily right or wrong, but they imply different things, and different values are embedded in which algorithms you use, not just mathematical modeling effectiveness. Right? And there's also this just basic problem when it comes to things like hiring, right? Which is, again, you can think of so many examples that look like this, but there's a problem of just you don't even have data on certain people, right? So hiring is a good example. So let's say I have data for 10 years on everyone that a certain company has hired, but also I have data on all of the applications that have come in, right? Well, the problem is, of course, that the people I didn't hire, I have no idea if they were good or not, right? So even if I could wave a magic wand and make it so that, the hiring algorithm I use is ethical in the way that I want, I actually still don't know if I was doing the right thing. It could have been I made tons of mistakes and I don't actually have that data, right? And so it's actually, interesting. You might have heard the example on the hiring side of Amazon, who didn't actually release this algorithm, but again, they were contemplating building a hiring algorithm for software developers. And so what they did is they fed in all their resumes for people they'd hired into the system. And then it turned out that basically the biggest predictor of who they should hire was whether or not the person had played lacrosse in college, and whether or not the person's name was Jared. Right. So, okay, what it's doing? It's selecting white guys. Like, we know what it's doing because people are biased. And, one of the big promises of AI and technology more broadly is to try to reduce those. Right. But again, the idea that if we just go into it blindly, right, and we don't think about, like, what do we actually care about? Like, again, I don't think anyone could credibly argue that it's fair to, that playing lacrosse and being named Jared is actually, predictive of your performance, right? That's just predictive of biases that people have, right? And so it's really interesting. One of the best examples of how I've seen companies actually avoid this, or at least give themselves permission to be wrong, right? Which I think is important whenever we design one of these systems, right? Is rather than assuming that data is going to, the distribution of what we're learning, like who's an effective employee or whatever, is going to, because what we do is when we train an algorithm, right, essentially what we say is we're replicating what happened in the past, and that we're tacitly assuming that that's going to continue forever. And so we can admit that, first of all, like the assumption should be by default that is not going to happen, right? Society, the world, technology changes all the time. And so what JetBlue did was for actually hiring, and to be fair, I don't know if they still use this. This is as of 2016, at least some of the folks I knew there knew their head of HR, and this is how they did it. Um, but so they developed a assessment, right, that they would run flight attendants through, and it had extremely high predictive power on whether or not that person, if they hired them, would still be with JetBlue 4 years later. Right? And this is important because the rule of thumb when someone leaves a company is that it costs 25% of that person's annual salary to restaff that position, which the U.S. government should probably think about that and what they're doing. But that's important to know, right? So losing people bad, right? You lose money in general, in addition to all the tacit knowledge, all this other stuff, right? Um, so one of the things they could have just done is said, all right, we're going to hire 0 people who don't pass this assessment, right? So that, we don't lose any of that money. But that's not what they did. What they did is they actually hired 10% of people who didn't pass that assessment. Right? And again, they were essentially giving themselves permission to be wrong. Now they were still, again, the question is, there is of course a question of should it be 10%, 5%, whatever. Again, you can estimate a financial hit of that. But the idea with any of these, systems is you can assume that whatever AI system you deployed is not going to be right, for all time, right, and will change, right? And so they were able to see that, and again, just monitor, like, if it turns out that actually this group is leaving the company at a lot lower rates than we thought, maybe we need to, retool this whole algorithm. And things like that are incredibly important, even after you've made decisions about what sort of things you're going to optimize for, right? Again, the idea that what is ethical, just in general, is highly contextual, and I can actually, tell a story. So you might have guessed, actually, I lived in Japan for a little bit, and I actually worked in a lab of a very large Japanese tech company that shall remain nameless. This is a while ago. It's like 16 years ago, and for the for the American, or let's say for the non-Japanese folks in the room, I mean, hopefully this has changed a little bit after COVID. But coming from the U.S., um, if I was sick and I had a really big project deadline, and I told my boss, you know, I know we've got a big project deadline, but I'm feeling too sick, so I'm not going to be able to finish the project, right? Like I'd be fired. Right? But so in Japan, so I was in this lab. It was a secure facility, right? So I couldn't like do work remotely. All the work I was doing in this lab had to be done on site, right? And the next day, so this one day I'm in the office and I'm starting to feel really sick, right? I've got I clearly have a really bad fever. I'm starting to sweat. I just feel terrible, right? But the next day, I had to give a presentation to the head of the lab, and so I was really just trying to grind through finishing up this deck, right? But then one of my coworkers comes over and he says, "Oh, you got to go home." And I told him, I'm like, "Listen, well, I might need you to give the presentation tomorrow, but I've got to finish the deck, so I'm going to stay here another couple hours, and then we'll see what happens." And he's like, "No, you have to go home." And so they forced me to go home. Right? And the next morning, even though I still wasn't feeling well, I tried to come in at 6 a.m. and they actually wouldn't let me into the building. Right? And again, to be clear, from like a public health perspective, right? What the lab did that I worked at is correct. Like fewer people will get sick if I just stayed at home. Right? But again, that's not like there's other things one could optimize for. Me not being in the office does change the way that my coworkers collaborate. And again, today, and again, in a non-secure environment, it would probably be easier for me to work from home, today. But again, there's not like a right answer to this. Like people are optimizing for different things, right? And those are choices. And what's always important is to not just assume, that initial reaction we have that, oh, of course you go home, or of course you stay in the office. That is not like, it's not, of course. Like, one can question that. Now, again, I'm not saying you do this about every decision all the time, but I think especially when we're designing, AI systems that are, automating processes and then are going to be very challenging, to discern whether we're actually optimizing for the right thing and can have effects that are, hugely negative before we actually realize them. It's that much more important to really gut check a lot of those assumptions, right? And again, this doesn't mean what this means, though, is that it's not saying you don't have, for example, if you're a global company, This doesn't mean you don't have a, global ethical framework. And again, I'll highly recommend looking at what HP Enterprise does on this front. But again, the idea that you need, sure, high level guidance that does apply across the company about how we think about things, but then that does need to be adapted to local contexts. And again, of course, you can go down to the level of a single person because everyone ultimately does have different ethical frameworks. But reasonable people could say, okay, do we do it for a region? Do we do it for an industry? Again, but those are decisions and discussions that need to be had, before you're starting to deploy things at a large scale. Again, obviously, this is more of a lesson for large organizations. If you're a startup, this isn't something you can do initially, but it is something you realize that, if you want to be responsible, right, that is something that is going to have to be done, right? And of course, another important thing is who's involved in developing these algorithms. And part of that, gets to what do we even consider as the envelope of possible when it comes to what we optimize for, how we build, what we would consider to be ethical systems. Right? And probably the best example that I've seen of this is actually the organ allocation algorithms in the US. There's a great book by this guy, David Robinson, called Voices in the Code that I would highly recommend that's on this topic. But initially, so there's this question when it comes to allocating kidneys, right? So if someone needs a kidney transplant, right? So if, I die and I'm an organ donor, right? Then who gets it? Well, one way to do it is you just give it to whoever's closest, but another way is to give it to whoever has the most quality years of life left. And again, there was originally that's how that was done, but obviously these things are heavily biased because people who are richer get access to more medical care, which means they live longer. And so really you're just making an algorithm to give it to rich people. That doesn't mean that that's like the fairest thing, right? And so what they've done is create something where these actually the allocation algorithm, it's a public process where you have medical personnel, people in public health, but you also have families of people who need an organ donation, families of people who gave an organ donation, people currently on the list. It's a whole variety of people. And again, they have a very elaborate process that they develop. I'd highly recommend. Again, it's too long for me to describe in this talk, but I think it's an example of how one can craft groups that do consider a lot of these different perspectives. And again, ultimately, you do have to implement something, but it's important to know what we're not implementing, and they do. And they again periodically revisit this to see like what do we want to do. And again, the idea that these systems, right, aren't like again, the idea that there's a certain data that doesn't exist. This, for example, is a prompt where if you say a Black African doctor helping, hungry white children, it comes up with this pretty much all the time, right? Again, because the data that is on the web that have trained a lot of these large models is inherently biased because the world is biased. So again, we have to think about what it means to embed these systems or entrust these systems, blindly with making single decisions, as well as doing other things. And I know I'm running out of time. I want to also mention that mathematically, it's actually impossible to be totally fair at all levels. So this is a problem, right? So for example, if I made an algorithm that hires an equal number of men and women and an equal number of black and white people, it could actually still be maximally unfair when it comes to intersectional groups. And so it puts you into this very difficult situation where actually for a lot of these things you have to choose who you're going to discriminate against, which is pretty bad, right? We can also choose to design systems in different ways. Again, I'll leave. I know I'm running out of time, so I won't belabor this point. There's a great paper by some folks out of Stanford called Jury Learning, which is essentially decomposes late data labelers to enable you to look at how different groups would actually rate something, rather than just outputting a single metric or a single prediction. I encourage people to learn more about human-computer interaction. There's a whole field that's about how do we design interactions. It's not just a text box because it's unclear to me why we've brought command prompts back. Command lines are terrible. They're terrible interface. But now we brought them back and they're stochastic. Like that's kind of weird. These are random rants. So I'll skip the rants. There's other things we can do. Great project. I'll just very briefly mention. I'm working with Boago Okathung and Takuji Sensei over at Okayama University on trying to use the labeling capabilities of LLMs to do different sort of things when it comes to defaults with these systems around hiring. All right, I'll end again. You can sort of tell I've sort of crammed in a few random rants here. One thing I'll say, especially when it comes to ethics, it is important to say people like, well, humans are, they're biased, they're not always ethical, which is true, right? but I think we use very flawed analogies. Like these systems are not humans, right? They're not. We could have a longer discussion about this, right? But it just so let me give an example. So imagine, well, it's funny because actually Microsoft, I guess, a few days ago released a generative AI like spreadsheet tool that's like 50 point something percent accurate. But here's the reason I'm bringing this up. So people use words like superhuman all the time, which it doesn't mean anything. Like a knife has superhuman cutting ability, but we don't say that because it doesn't make any sense, right? So people with a high school degree in the U.S. Um, can make an error in four-digit addition about 0.7% of the time. Okay. So let's say I can make an AI spreadsheet system that's better than that, right? That only makes an error, let's say it's 0.5% of the time, right? So what that means is that if I gave you a spreadsheet like this, zero point 0.5 of the cells would be randomly wrong, and you don't know which cells, right? It's unusable. It's actually unusable, right? Now, again, that doesn't mean that I would have a person, hand calculate all these different cells. That doesn't make any sense, but use a freaking calculator, right? Like we do have good tools for these things. And so rather than putting everything in a single Omni tool that we need to use it for everything, let's use the right tool for the right thing. All right. You know, that's the end of my rant. Thanks everyone for listening. Sorry for ranting at the end there and running through it, but it was again great to at least virtually be there. And yeah, happy to, if we have time, happy to take questions. Otherwise, yeah, feel free to reach out. And happy to chat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben Waber. We need a week to give everybody, all of our incredible speakers, to just share everything and anything. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much.